The weight of the betrayal sat heavy in her chest, suffocating her. She had always believed that if something like this ever happened, she would know exactly what to do. She would leave. She would never allow herself to be disrespected. But now that it was real, now that she had seen the proof with her own eyes, she felt frozen. The messages on his phone had been undeniable. Flirty conversations, late-night rendezvous, the kind of words a husband should never be sending to another woman. And yet, there they were. She had confronted him, expecting excuses, expecting him to deny it, but he hadn't. He had sighed, run a hand through his hair, and simply said, "It didn't mean anything," as if that made it better. She had barely processed his betrayal when she turned to the two people she thought she could count on most, her mother and her daughter. She had imagined them rallying around her, comforting her, telling her that she didn't deserve this, that she should walk away and never look back. But instead, their words shattered her more than her husband's did. Her mother had sighed, shaking her head. "Sweetheart, all men cheat. It's just how they are." Her stomach had twisted violently. "Excuse me?" Her mother's expression had been calm, almost dismissive. "You're overreacting. You've built a life with him, raised a daughter together. You can't just throw all of that away over a few mistakes." Her daughter, sitting across from her, had nodded in agreement. "Mum, I know it hurts, but it's not like he's leaving you. He still loves you." She had felt like she was drowning. Her own daughter, her little girl, thought this was something she should tolerate. She had grown up watching their marriage, believing it was strong, that they were a family built on trust. And yet here she was, siding with her father's betrayal. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. "Are you both seriously telling me to stay with a man who cheated on me?" Her mother let out a small laugh. "Oh, honey, you think you're the first wife this has ever happened to? You think I didn't go through the same thing with your father?" She felt sick. All these years her mother had known about her father's infidelity. And stayed. Her daughter's voice was softer, hesitant. "I just don't want our family to fall apart." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. It already has. She expected the realization to hit them, for them to see how broken she was, how unforgivable this was. But neither of them looked surprised. They had already decided for her. She had two choices: accept the betrayal and pretend it didn't happen, or walk away, alone. And for the first time, she realized they didn't expect her to choose herself. The uneasy feeling had been creeping in for weeks. It started with small things: late nights at work, a change in his phone habits, the way he suddenly seemed more interested in his appearance. At first, she convinced herself she was overthinking. She didn't want to be that wife, the paranoid one, the insecure one, but the signs kept piling up. He stopped touching her the way he used to. His conversations became shorter, filled with vague explanations and excuses that didn't quite add up. And then there was the phone, always face down, always in his pocket, always protected by a password she no longer knew. Her heart told her the truth before she ever saw the proof. That night, as he showered, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone on the nightstand. Her hands were shaking as she picked it up. She told herself she wouldn't look, that she shouldn't look, but she did. The password was different. Her chest tightened. He had changed it. Her hands trembled as she tried again, using the birth dates of their daughter, their anniversary. Nothing worked. That was it. The final confirmation. He had something to hide. When he stepped out of the bathroom, steam curling behind him, she was already standing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold, controlled. His eyes flickered to his phone. He knew. She had expected him to deny it, to lie, to scramble for excuses, but instead he sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "I don't want to fight," he said, voice tired. "Yes, I messed up. I made a mistake. But it didn't mean anything." She felt like the air had been stolen from her lungs. It didn't mean anything. Her marriage, their vows, their family, meant nothing. The pain hit her all at once, burning through her like fire. "That's all you have to say," she whispered, "that it didn't mean anything." He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I never planned for it to happen. It just did." His words stabbed into her chest like a knife. She clenched her fists, her body shaking with rage and heartbreak. Who is she? It doesn't matter. Her stomach churned. It mattered to her. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. "You destroyed our marriage, and you think I should just, what? Get over it?" His jaw tightened. "I'm saying we can move past this." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Move past it? Everything inside her screamed no. But what she didn't know was that the real betrayal was still coming. Because the moment she turned to her family for support, she would realize she was standing alone. She sat across from her mother, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her world had just fallen apart, and this was the one place she thought she'd find comfort, support, and maybe even some clarity. But the moment she finished telling her mother everything, she saw the disappointment, not in him, the man who had betrayed her, but in her. Her mother let out a long sigh, shaking her head. "Sweetheart, you're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be." Her stomach twisted. "A bigger deal," she repeated, barely recognizing her own voice. Her mother gave her a knowing look, one that made her feel like a naive child. "All men cheat," she said simply. "It's just in their nature." The words hit her harder than she thought possible. "You can't be serious." Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly. "I know it hurts, but you have to think logically. Do you really want to throw your marriage away over a mistake?" She pulled her hand away. "A mistake?" The word tasted bitter in her mouth. "He betrayed me, Mom. He lied to me, snuck around behind my back, slept with another woman. That's not just a mistake." Her mother pursed her lips, her voice calm, almost condescending. "And yet, he's still here, isn't he? He didn't leave you for her. He still wants his family." A cold wave of realization washed over her. Her mother truly believed this. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "If Dad had done this to you, would you have stayed?" Her mother's expression didn't even flicker. "He did." Silence. Her breath caught. She never knew. Her mother shrugged as if it wasn't even worth discussing. It was a different time. Women didn't just walk away from their marriages because of a little infidelity. Her hands balled into fists. A little infidelity? "So what?" she snapped. "You're saying I should just ignore it? Pretend it didn't happen?" Her mother sighed again, frustration creeping into her tone. "I'm saying you need to be smart. You have a life, a home, a daughter to think about. You're not some 20-year-old girl who can start over easily. Do you really want to throw away everything you've built?" The words cut deep. Because for a moment she understood. The fear of starting over, of facing the unknown, the fear of losing the family she had spent years building, the fear of admitting that the person she trusted most had never truly valued her. But then she thought about what staying would mean. It would mean accepting that her pain didn't matter, that her husband could betray her and face no real consequences. She refused to live like that. Her voice was shaky but firm. "I won't stay with a man who doesn't respect me." Her mother shook her head, disappointment clear in her eyes. "Then you'll end up alone." She swallowed the lump in her throat. Better alone than betrayed. She turned away from her mother, her chest tightening as she tried to process what had just been said. All men cheat. It played over and over in her mind like a broken record, making her stomach turn. She needed fresh air, space, anything to stop the suffocating feeling creeping in. As she stepped into the living room, she saw her daughter sitting on the couch, phone in hand, legs tucked beneath her. For a brief moment, she felt relief. Her daughter would understand. She had to. She sat down beside her, exhaling slowly. "Did you hear what your grandmother just said?" Her voice was shaky, still raw from the conversation. Her daughter barely glanced up. "Yeah," she muttered. "She's not wrong." The words landed like a slap. Her heart pounded in her ears. "What?" Her daughter finally looked at her, her expression bored, indifferent, like none of this was a big deal. "Mom, I get that you're upset, but Dad still loves you. He didn't leave, did he?" Her hands clenched into fists. "That doesn't excuse what he did." Her daughter sighed, setting her phone down. "But why do you have to make it such a big deal? It's not like he's in love with someone else. It was just a mistake." A mistake. That's what her husband had called it. That's what her mother had called it. Now her daughter was saying it too. Her breath caught in her throat. "Is that what you think?" she asked softly. "That it's okay as long as he stays?" Her daughter shrugged. "I mean, yeah. Look around, Mom. This is just how life is. People cheat, couples fight, but we're a family. And if you leave, you're the one ruining that, not Dad." Her body went cold. She felt like she was staring at a stranger. How had her own daughter come to believe this? She blinked, struggling to find her voice. "So if someone cheats, we just accept it? No consequences? No self-respect?" Her daughter's expression hardened. Self-respect isn't going to pay the bills. It's not going to keep a roof over our heads. Her throat tightened. That was her mother's voice. That was the lesson her daughter had unknowingly absorbed over the years, watching her parents. Her daughter had seen her mother stay silent when she felt lonely. She had seen her lower her voice when her husband dismissed her feelings. She had seen her push through exhaustion, through neglect, through all the small moments of disrespect she never fought back against. And now her daughter believed that was normal. A tear slipped down her cheek as realization hit. She had let this happen. She had never wanted to raise a daughter who thought her worth depended on a man's loyalty. But somehow she had. She inhaled shakily. "I can't let you believe that." Her daughter frowned. "Believe what?" "That this is love." Her voice was firm now. "That a woman should ever settle for less than she deserves." Her daughter scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Mum, you're overreacting." But she wasn't. For the first time, she was seeing the damage done, and she would not allow this to be the example she set, even if it meant walking away from everything. She sat at the dinner table, her stomach twisting as her mother and daughter continued talking as if this was a simple decision, as if accepting betrayal was the only reasonable thing to do. Her mother took a sip of her tea, her voice calm but firm. "You need to think about the bigger picture. You have a house, a family, a husband who still provides for you. Do you really want to throw that away?" Her daughter nodded, arms crossed over her chest. "Divorce is messy, Mom. And for what? Dad made a mistake, but it's not like he's leaving you. Why can't you just move on?" She swallowed the lump in her throat, struggling to form words. "Move on," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother gave her a look filled with pity. Yes, move on. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Do you really want to start over at your age? Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table. At your age. As if her life was over. As if she had no other option but to stay in a marriage built on lies. She turned to her daughter, hoping, praying that she would see the damage in these words. Is that what you think love is? That it's just something you hold on to, even when the person you trust betrays you? Her daughter let out an exasperated sigh. I think people make mistakes, and I think you're being dramatic. If Dad still loves you and he's still here, why break up our family over something that already happened? Something inside her cracked. She slowly looked at her husband, who had been silent this entire time. Watching, waiting. He had no fear of losing her, because he knew they were doing the work for him. He sat there with no remorse, no desperation, no guilt. Just a quiet patience, as if he was waiting for her to realize what everyone else already had. She was expected to accept this. Her mother, her daughter, her husband, they had all made the decision for her. They believed that she would choose comfort over self-respect, that she would rather keep the family intact than walk away with dignity. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. So that's it? She asked, her voice steady now. I should just lower my standards? Accept that my marriage means nothing? That my husband can do whatever he wants, and as long as he still comes home, I should be grateful? Her mother sighed again, as if exhausted by her refusal to be reasonable. Her daughter frowned, confused by her reaction, and her husband. He smirked. That was the moment she knew. She was done, and they would never see it coming. She stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp in the thick silence. No one expected her to leave. Her mother sighed, shaking her head. Oh, don't be dramatic, dear. Sit down and let's talk this through like adults. Her daughter frowned. Mom, please. You're just upset right now. You don't have to make a decision tonight. But she had already made her decision. She looked at her mother first, the woman who had raised her, who had once told her she deserved the world, and now was telling her to settle for scraps. You stayed when Dad cheated, didn't you? Her mother pursed her lips. Yes, and I survived. I made it work because that's what strong women do. Her stomach twisted at the words. Strong women don't let themselves be humiliated. They don't let men walk all over them and call it survival. Her mother's face hardened, but she didn't care. She was done listening. She turned to her daughter next, her voice softer now. You think I should stay because Dad still loves me, because breaking up our family is worse than what he did. Her daughter nodded hesitantly. It's just, I don't want everything to change. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. It already has. Her daughter looked away, and for a moment, guilt gripped her chest. She hated that this would hurt her. But what kind of mother would she be if she taught her daughter that betrayal was something to accept? She looked at her husband last, the man who had promised to love and respect her, the man who had destroyed their marriage with his selfishness, and he wasn't even sorry. She had expected anger from him, maybe regret, a desperate plea for her to stay, but no, he just sat there, watching her, waiting, because he still didn't believe she would actually leave. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then, with a voice clear and unwavering, she said, I deserve better. Her mother scoffed. Better than what? A husband who provides for you? A home? Stability? She clenched her fists. Better than a life where I have to pretend I'm happy. Better than teaching my daughter that she should accept whatever a man gives her, even if it's filled with lies." Her husband let out a quiet laugh, leaning back in his chair. "And where do you think you're gonna go?" She smiled, despite the pain in her chest. "Anywhere but here." Then she turned, walked into their bedroom, and grabbed her suitcase. She wasn't staying one more night in a house where she was only valued when it was convenient. She would leave with nothing before she stayed and lost herself completely. She walked toward the door, gripping the handle, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. Behind her, voices rose in protest. Her mother's sharp tone cut through the air. "You're making a mistake. You're going to regret this." Her daughter's voice was quieter, but it hit even harder. "Mum, please don't go. Just think about this a little longer." She closed her eyes for a second, steadying herself. If she turned around now, she'd stay forever. Her husband stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't try to stop her, didn't beg her to reconsider, because he still believed she wouldn't do it. She turned the handle, stepping outside. The cold air hit her face, but she didn't shiver. She breathed. For the first time in years, she felt free. She didn't look back. The first few nights were the hardest. She sat in a small apartment with barely anything to her name. The bed felt too big, the silence too heavy. She missed her daughter. But every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the alternative, staying in a house where she wasn't respected. She found a job, reached out to friends she had lost touch with, built something new for herself. Piece by piece, she was putting herself back together. Her mother called, but only to remind her of what she had walked away from. "Your daughter hardly speaks to me now. You should have stayed for her." She gritted her teeth, holding back tears. She had stayed for everyone else her entire life. Now she was staying true to herself. Months passed before her daughter reached out. A simple text. "Can we talk?" Her hands shook as she typed back, "Always." When they met, her daughter looked different, not angry anymore, just lost. "I didn't get it before," she admitted, her voice small. "But Dad's already dating again." She let out a bitter laugh. Guess it didn't ruin his life as much as everyone thought. She swallowed hard, waiting. Her daughter hesitated. Did it hurt, leaving? She exhaled softly. "More than anything." A pause, then, "Do you regret it?" She reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing gently. Not for a second. Tears welled in her daughter's eyes. "I think I understand now." She smiled through her own tears. "I hoped you would." Because walking away was the hardest thing she had ever done. But teaching her daughter that she deserved better, that made every step worth it.